Tonight, we have Sandra Warren, who will be speaking on her book about World War II. It is We Bought a Bomber, a school in the west side of Michigan helped with the war bonds in selling so many that they bought a B-17 bomber. Her book is the highlight of this evening. She will be speaking on what happened to it, the school and the classmates, and the outcome of their research. So please help me in welcoming Sandra Warren.
Thank you, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to speak to all of you, especially all of you veterans. And let me first say thank you very much for your service. Patriotism, my goodness, we certainly could use more of it, don't you think, now, today? And last night I spoke to the Civil Air Patrol and was very much pleased and surprised and honored to think that here are all these young people that really have the patriotic spirit. Well, tonight I'm going to talk to you about other children that had the patriotic spirit and the spirit that did an absolutely amazing and astounding thing. This is a story I'm sure you've never heard before because I didn't realize when I got into this that no one has ever written a book about this program that was initiated by the United States Treasury to help pay for World War II. And they did an interesting thing. Let me get a little bit further. In order to encourage people to invest in America and invest in war bonds and war stamps, which was the way they paid for the war, they lodged all different kinds of funding programs to encourage people to buy bonds and stamps. And this particular one here was another elementary school in Grand Rapids, Michigan that showed proof that they had sold $900 in war bonds and they were able to buy a Jeep. But the program we're going to talk to you about tonight is the Buy a Bomber program. And I must apologize to you because I did not have time to do the research. But those of you who love World War II research, you should go down to your local library after the speech, well, not tonight, but maybe tomorrow or in a couple of days, and go into the newspaper files because in the back of my book is listed an appendix with over 220 other businesses, churches, organizations, cities, and counties who bought bombers through the Buy a Bomber program. And Ypsilanti, the city of Ypsilanti, bought a B-24. Well, they better buy a B-24. The factory's right over a hop, skip, and a jump from where we're sitting. So this really is a story not just about a school in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It really is a story about the patriotism that permeated America during World War II. And I'm guessing 99% of the Americans, from the tiniest child to the most elderly, were all patriotic. Everyone wasn't, but I would guess 99% of them were all behind our veterans. So when we think about how history records war, we think about the causes, the battles fought. They talk about the victories and the treaties signed, and seldom ever do they talk about what was going on back at the home front. And I think, now this is my theory, no one's proved me wrong and no one's proved me right, but my theory is that we have so much information about home front America during World War II because of the little brownie camera. By the time the 40s rolled around, the camera industry had become inexpensive enough so that families could have a camera in their home and they could take pictures. And so we have tons and tons of pictures. Some of you probably have them in your boxes at home, pictures of what was going on during the home front. And the only way to really understand the story I'm going to tell you tonight is to take a look at home front America during World War II. Of course, you know, and most of you would know, that everything was rationed. You would line up, families would line up at the rationing board to pick up their coupon books, and everyone got a coupon book. So if you had an infant, that infant got a coupon book too. So if you had a lot of tiny children, you had more coupons to buy more food, more clothing, more, I don't think you got more gas, but you were able to purchase more with your coupon books. And people lined up and they didn't complain. I'm sure they didn't complain because they were grateful for what they were able to get. Food was rationed, all kinds of food, milk, bread, cheese, bacon, and all the staples. And even clothing, a lot of clothing, shoes, and of course gas was rationed. I believe it was 3 gallons, 3 gallons a week you could have. I don't remember exactly, but you couldn't have a lot of gas either. And lives for women changed drastically. Now I love this upper one where the sign says, "Ladies, turn in your silk and nylon stockings. We need them for gunpowder bags." And as you see, there's a big pile. So the ladies turned them in. And I'm sure many of you remember, as a gentleman, I thought this was interesting, a gentleman last week came up to me afterwards and he says, "I remember when the ladies took I don't know what they used, but they painted the line, they painted the seam up the back of their legs to make it look like they had nylons on." And I said, well, now that's an interesting thing coming from a man. I would have expected a woman to say, "I remember my grandma saying," but at any rate. So they gave up their stockings, they gave up a lot, and they went into the factories, as you know. The Rosie the Riveters were right a hop, skip, and a jump from here, as they were in California building the B-17s and all over this country. The men 18 to 38 were gone, and women had to step up to the plate, and life changed drastically in America during this time. Life for the children also changed, and the children got involved and were involved and stayed involved, and they felt it as much their patriotic duty as did the adults, that they had to do something to help their fathers, brothers, cousins, and who were over there fighting. The children, they had a lot of collection drives. Well, there were collection drives everywhere. And of course, this was really the first huge and probably the most efficient recycling campaign this country has ever seen. Of course, that word wasn't coined until a few years ago, but that's exactly what it was. I mean, anything and everything that could be saved was saved, from old pieces of carpeting to rubber hoses to paper, scraps of paper. Anything and everything could be saved. And here you see children collected. Look at all those pots and pans. Well, you know, President Roosevelt said, "Ladies, 1 pot for every kitchen is all you really need." And the women turned the pots in. And I spoke last year to the varsity club at South High School. It still meets, even though the school closed in 1968. The varsity club still meets. And I said, now, this medal campaign, there's a reason why there are no sports trophies before, I'm not sure if it was 42 or 43, but the advisor of the WWII Bomber program and the principal got together for the big collection drive for metal and brass and aluminum and anything metal, and decided, as an example to the children, they were going to take all the sports trophies and turn them over to the war effort. So now you probably get shot if you tried that today, but they did that back in the 40s. And of course, the children collected rubber. Rubber was a big deal. There were all kinds of posters everywhere that said, you know, they need them more than you, and they would show a soldier in a Jeep, and they'd show the rubber, and you were told, don't go for rides. Children were told, don't ride your bikes, because that rubber is needed by the soldiers. Also, there were victory gardens. Now, the victory gardens were encouraged so that you had something to eat, because most of the commercially grown food was being made into food for our troops. There were hundreds of thousands of troops going over to Europe and hundreds of thousands of troops going to Japan. And another thing I did not know, maybe some of you knew this, but it wasn't until a few months ago I was speaking in Charlotte, North Carolina, and an English couple was sitting in the crowd. And when I talked about the food being rationed, the gentleman gasped. And afterwards he raised his hand, and in a very British accent he said, you know, I was 7 years old living in London, and America sent us the most wonderful powdered eggs. They were yellow, and my mother would scramble them up, and they were just wonderful. And then after the war, we couldn't get them anymore. And he said, you know, we thought Americans had so much extra food, they were just sharing their food with us. We had no idea that they were sacrificing by rationing so that we could eat. You see, America, in addition, was also sending food to England because the English people were starving because they were being bombarded. The heck was being bombarded out of them, and there were the U-boats, and there just was no source for food. So Canada and the United States helped feed them, and I was not aware of that at all. So patriotism was high. You had Hitler marching through Europe, threatening the Atlantic coast, and you had the Japanese on the Pacific coast. And I think the closest emotionally younger Americans today could even begin to understand what that must have felt like was what happened when the Twin Towers came down. For maybe a few hours or a few days, we were shocked, we were horrified, and then we were scared, and then we got angry. And just as in World War II, when after Pearl Harbor, many young men changed their plans for the future and joined the military, so too young men following the Twin Towers coming down, they also did the same thing, and many young men changed their plans and went to fight for our freedom. Now, war is expensive, and one of the main ways outside of taxes that war was going to be paid for was through the sale of savings bonds and war stamps. And hence comes the basis for the story that we have. 57% of the cost of war after taxes was paid for by Americans buying war bonds and war stamps. Now, let me just go back and say, you know, everything was rationed. But the other side of that was everyone was working. There was almost no unemployment. People were working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. They had more money than they ever had. And they couldn't go on trips because that was discouraged because of rubber and gas and any means that you would get there. So what did people do? They saved. And what better way to save than buying a war bond or a war stamp? And that's what the Treasury Department got very smart about tagging into. And another thing, just to take a look at what the cost of living was like. You know, you talk about giving the kids a 25-cent stamp, 25 cents to go buy a stamp in school. And yet, 25 cents, well, 27 cents could buy a loaf of bread and a dozen eggs. So this was not an easy decision for families. Even though there was the other component that there was a lot more money coming in, it still was not an easy time for families to turn over the money. And you can see the equivalents over there. I have not changed those equivalents. You know, the dollar changes every day. So up or down a few cents or a few dollars, that might be different. So let's talk now about a little bit more about the children. Many of you who are my age or older, would remember that the weekly readers came into the schools every week in elementary schools all across this country, and they were filled with local news. And I was really surprised as I went back to look through the weekly readers at how completely realistic and detailed the articles were about war. They did not pussyfoot around, and some of the articles you would never see in a school in the modern world and in today's world. Now, this particular weekly reader talks about the number of tanks and bombers and guns that were going to be made in that year, and some of them, and battleships. And we're talking like 100,000 bombers or whatever. The numbers are really, really amazing. And the posters, you know, I spoke to these young people last night, and I said, you know, now you got to remember there was no TV. There were no computers. So there was no internet. So how did these kids do this? Well, there was the newspaper, there was the radio, and there were posters, and there were the newsreels at the movies. However, having said that, as I continue, I will tell you right now, I have no evidence that the radio was ever used for the campaign we're going to talk about. So the Buy a Bomber program, it all started at South High School in Mr. Mulder's 8th grade classroom. He read an article in the Weekly Reader that talked about the Buy a Bomber program. And here's what it said. If you could show proof that you raised or initiated sales of war bonds and war stamps to the tune of $75,000, you could buy a pursuit fighter. But if you could show proof that you raised $375,000, you could buy a B-17 or a B-24 bomber. And if you achieved this remarkable feat, you could name it. And if you named it, we'll paint it on the side of the bomber and we'll fly it into your hometown and you can have a dedication ceremony. So, sitting in the back of the room was little 13-year-old Arthur Blackboard. Now, Arthur is still with us, and he will tell you that he was very, very shy. He never raised his hand in class, and he says to this day he has no idea why his hand shot up. And he said, "Mr. Mulder, why don't we do that?" So that started the ball game rolling. He was sent to the principal's office. The principal agreed, let's try to do this. But then Mr. Mulder and Mr. Coryell, the principal, got together and said, whoa, wait a minute. If we're going to look at trying to raise $75,000, we can't let 8th graders be in charge of this. We have to get some older students involved. So they went to the student council, and Dave Dutcher and Grace Moyer, both juniors, stepped forward. Now, I am particularly grateful, as if you're interested and like the book, you will be, in that Dave Dutcher was a saver. He not only was an exceptional leader, he was a saver, and even more than that, his mother was a saver, because he saved the South High Tattlers. Now, the South High Tattler was a newspaper that came out every other week, and in those Tattlers, it detailed everything going on in the school. So it detailed what was going on with this Buy a Bomber program. And when I started calling around to some of the alumni, trying to find out about what did you do? Were you a part of this program? Arthur, bless his heart, I said to him, so you were named co-chairman, so what was your role? And he said, well, I bought a stamp or two. And so after he instigated it, he really didn't participate that much. And I thought, well, that only gives me a sentence or two. That's not going to make a book. But then I called David Dutcher, and he said, I've got just the thing for you. For his 40th high school reunion, I must say that he was a successful Grand Rapids lawyer. He spiral bound the South High Tattlers and gave them to his class at their, believe it was his 40th reunion. And because of that, he had extra ones. And when I called him, he said, I've got just what you need. And of course, you can see I kind of messed him up a little bit with all the little notes. Okay, so now the kids are excited. They're going to buy a pursuit fighter. They're going to raise $75,000, and it's going to take them 12 weeks. They decided they could do this in 12 weeks' time. They were starting mid-December 1942, and they thought by April 1st, 1943, they would have their pursuit fighter. So they did this lovely poster. They had an assembly, and everyone got excited. Well, So the campaign is starting, and again, Mr. Mulder goes, whoa, we need some more help here. So they called in a South High grad who is now the chairman of the Kent County Retailers War Savings Committee. Now, he had the marketing expertise, and so he laid it all out and said, okay, kids, this is how it's going to happen. One of my questions when I heard this story was, you can't tell me kids brought $75,000 through the doors of those schools, or $375,000. And of course they didn't. These savings stamps were sold in school, and many of you probably remember, I mean, I was born during World War II, but I remember buying savings stamps in school when I was in elementary school. They were sold through school, but the war bonds were filtered through the banks. And one of the first things that happened, and it obviously was important to Mr. Mulder and the principal, was that they took Mr. Mulder put together 2,000 flyers that explained exactly how to buy a war bond, because a lot of people had never bought a war bond. And so that's what the kids took out and distributed among their neighbors, their families, their relatives. And the people took it into the factories and shared this program. And they said, if you buy a war bond, would you please give credit to South High School for their Buy a Bomber program? They want to buy a B-17, a pursuit fighter. They're trying to raise $75,000. And I always laugh because just think if your grandchildren or children come home and say, guess what? We're going to go out and we're going to raise $75,000 and we're going to buy a bomber. You're going to go, I don't think so. But anyway, so that's how it all happened. Now, in school, things changed too, because everything became, anything that you would pay for in school, suddenly now you paid for with a 10-cent stamp, a 25-cent stamp, 3 25-cent stamps. Going to a dance, you paid for them with a savings stamp. There was a tradition of a silent auction at one of the major dances, and now to buy anything at that silent auction, you had to buy it with a savings bond. So the band concerts, and if you were good during the day, your 7th hour entertainment, the last hour of the day, you were for a 10-cent or a 25-cent savings stamp, you could go see a movie, or it might be a variety show or a theatrical production. So the campaign began mid-December, and everyone got really excited about it, and along about 3.5 weeks into it, the treasurer went to the kids and said, whoa, look, if we're going to achieve this goal by April 1st, you have to bring in $6,000 worth of bond sales a week, or we're never going to make this. Well, that really got the kids fired up, because a little more than 3.5 weeks later, they had their $75,000. About 7 weeks into their 12-week campaign, they had raised and showed proof that they had initiated sales of $75,000 in war bonds and war stamps. Now, one of the things my friend said to me right away, oh, well, you went to one of those rich schools. Well, let me tell you, South High was not a rich school. It was probably one of the least wealthy schools in the area. It was the school where everyone was moving into, all the factory workers were moving up to work in all the factories in the Grand Rapids area. And so there was all different ethnic, there was a tremendous ethnic mix, and it was not a wealthy school at all. So now, if you can see here, $75,000 in 1943 is equivalent to $1,049,667.15. That was as of last week. I don't know what it's worth now, but it's close. So if you can imagine, little kids, they bought their bomber in 7 weeks' time. They've got 5 weeks left. What do you think they said? Let's go for the big one. Oh, wait a minute, I forgot. Here's the bomber. It was an AT-6A North American Texas trainer. And I always laugh here because in high school, you know, you don't do anything without a queen. And so here's the bomber queen and her court. Now, many of the people on the committee, including Dave Dutcher himself, said we never had that pursuit fighter because we immediately switched to we wanted to go for the big one. And I said, well, I've got a picture of him standing in front of one. So anyways, so there's the pursuit fighter. And so they set this new goal. They got all excited. They did another poster, and as you can see right away, that is not a B-17, but that's okay. We'll give that to them. The young boy on the ladder up tall, that's Arthur Blackport, and he was the instigator. And instead of taking down the pursuit fighter poster, they attached it to the bottom because that was good incentive. Look what we did in 7 weeks. We got 5 weeks left. Let's start the other campaign. So they called the parents in this time, and they had another huge assembly. Now, what I didn't tell you, and I should have probably told you before, is South High School was not just a 9 through 12. It was a 7 through 12, and there were 1,500 students. So it wasn't just 9, 10, 11, and 12th grades. It was all 6 grades. So on February 14th, they started the campaign to add $300,000 and to buy a B-17 bomber. And to the amazement and astoundment of everybody involved, 2 weeks later, on February 26th, they had brought in an additional $300,000 in bomber sales. Now, you don't just stop a campaign like this. People were going to the banks and they were investing. You know, President Roosevelt asked everyone to give 10% of their paycheck every week to the war effort. And so every week people were going to the banks and buying bonds. So the money kept rolling in. So the committee decided on a new goal. They were going to buy 1 disaster vehicle a week until June 11th, the end of school. Now, the dedication for the bomber was set for April 6th, 5 days after their first goal of April 1st. And by the time April 6th rolled around, they had enough additional money to buy 2 disaster vehicles. Now, a disaster vehicle was a combination canteen, ambulance, and hospital vehicle. So it was very important, used on the front. I have no knowledge that they continued buying disaster vehicles. That wasn't in any of the tattlers, so I don't know if they bought more. But on April 6, 1943, the Spirit of South High, which is what they called it, was dedicated at a huge ceremony in Grand Rapids, Michigan at the Kent County Airport. There were over 5,000 people at the airport, dignitaries, the governor, the mayor, the commander of Lockbourne Air Force Base, and the general in charge of the United States Army Air Force at the time sent a wonderful telegram. He couldn't be there, but he sent a wonderful telegram commending the children for this amazing achievement that they had done. Well, they had this amazing, wonderful ceremony, involved the Gold Star mothers. They reunited a soldier with his wife, gave him a 24-hour leave, and they did all kinds of extra things at this ceremony, which I thought was really cool. And the bomber flew off with all the dreams of these young children. Of course, this bomber, the Spirit of South High, was going to save the war. And it flew off and nobody heard a thing about it. And every time the alumni got together, and anytime anybody went to the movies, did you see that movie reel? I just know that was our bomber. I could see a little bit of white paint. I think that was the Spirit of South High. So there were all these mythical stories that had grown up over the years about how our bomber had been instrumental in saving the war. Well, years went by, and still, nobody knew anything about it. So in 1990, a gentleman, an alumni, named Robert Trufflemeyer, who was a historian, decided he was going to find the bomber. And so he wrote to the military, because you see all of the photographs we have of the ceremony and that, the tail numbers are very clear. So we had the tail numbers. Well, even in 1990, Can you believe 1990 we did not have the internet yet? In 1990, he wrote to the military, and they said they would get to it. And a month went by, and another month, and 8 months went by, and finally Robert says, "Forget this. I'm gonna call in the big guy." Well, you see, the big guy was Gerald R. Ford, our former president. He graduated from South High in 1931. Yay! And in 1930, following, he was the captain of the football team, and following one of their first games at their brand new football field, he got all the members together. There were 30 members of the football team in 1930, and they decided that before the big game between South High and Union, which always took place on Thanksgiving morning, they were going to all go out to breakfast. So they called themselves the 30-30 Club, and for the next 64 plus years, Thanksgiving morning, they all gathered for breakfast. And when President Ford was in the White House, he had all the men. I don't think I have it on the slide. No, I don't. He had them all at the White House for breakfast. And I always laugh because the photograph very clearly shows all the wives standing behind them in their minks. And I said, I can guarantee you that is the only 30-30 Club breakfast that those women were ever allowed to go to. So now, jump from 1990 to 2012, and my 50th high school reunion, it's hard to say. I decided I was going to do a program that everyone would listen to because, you know, when you go to a reunion, nobody listens to the program that's going on. So I put together a history of South High School, Finding the Spirit, because the alumni from South High School have this amazing spirit. And so I told the story that ended with the fact that the bomber was found. Oh, I didn't tell you what President Ford found. The word came back. It was used for training. Everyone was disheartened. This bomber was going to save the war, and it never even went to war. It never fought in one battle. And it was dismantled in Columbus, Ohio. Not only didn't it go to war, we can't even go look at it. And there was always hope that it was in someone's World War II museum, like maybe here, you know. And so Joe heard me. Joe was at that reunion, and after I spoke, he says he overheard me say to a bunch of people who had come up to me afterwards, you know, I don't know why the alums were so disheartened. A B-17 bomber has a crew of 10. It has radio operators and engineers and pilots and bombardiers. I mean, it well could have trained in the 18 months it was in service, literally hundreds, if not thousands of young men, and it very well could have affected the war. And it turns out, because I will tell you shortly what we found out about the bomber, that one of the young pilots who was on the bomber on the last day became a high-ranking colonel, and he helped develop the release system for the bomb over Hiroshima. So talk about affecting the war. One of the pilots trained on our bomber. That's what he became, and that's just one of them. So anyway, so Joe overheard me say, you know, it could have trained thousands of servicemen. And he decided, because he's a veteran, he decided he was going to find the log for our bomber to find out how many men did our bomber train. Well, he started searching because now we have the internet. And he started searching, and he said it took him quite a while, but it wasn't, he never found the log. What he found was a crash report for stateside military crashes during World War II. And there on that list, on October 1st, 1944, was our bomber, Bomber 42-29577. It was on that list. So he bought a couple copies of the report from the military, and those of you in the military know if anything happens, everyone involved has to write their version of it. So in this report, we have 6 crew members. There was an engineer and 5 pilots. Now this our bomber on the last day was not training new pilots. These 5 men were all combat veterans. 4 of them had done their 25 sorties over out of England over Germany, and the captain, Captain Arvel Stredbeck, had done 52 sorties out of North Africa. And so they were all training to be commanders of their own ships. You know, they called them ships then, and my critique partners kept saying they weren't ships, they were planes. I said, no, they called them ships. Anyways, so they were training to be commanders of their own ships. And the captain, I will tell you, he's still alive. He told me this was a night mission, and they were going from Lockbourne Air Force Base in Columbus, Ohio, to Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. It was a night mission, a very quick trip, 2.5 hours down, a half hour on the ground, 2.5 hours back. The captain told me what they were really doing extra training on, in addition to being a commander. You know, when you're a commander of your own ship, you need to know how to do every job on the ship. So as they went down, they were rotating positions down and back. And but he said they were also doing additional training on the Norden Bombsight. And many of you know that the Norden Bombsight was top secret. America had it, didn't think Germany had it. Turns out at the very, very, very end of the war, supposedly Germany had it, but it was an analytical computer, which among other things, and I say that because I got pilots in here who know more than I do, it was an analytical computer that took into consideration altitude, wind speed, and trajectory to hit the targets, and that's why they were so lethal and they were so accurate during World War II, is because we had that amazing technology. Well, at any rate, so on the way to Montgomery, Alabama, the fog started rolling in, but it wasn't too bad. It was overcast. They landed fine, and they were cleared for takeoff. And on the way back to Columbus, Ohio, the fog rolled in, and it got more and more dense. Now, the high-tech navigational systems used then was the RDF system, the radio direction finder. And that system relied heavily on being able to hear the pings that came from the radio towers that were spaced at the airports across the country. Well, you all know what happens in a storm with our modern technology with cell phones and with the internet. I mean, I live in the mountains of North Carolina, and let me tell you, a little bit of rain, a few clouds go by, and a little bit of wind, and we lose everything. So even with our modern technology, the weather affects it. So you can imagine way back then. And long about Chattanooga, they had no idea where they were. They kept making adjustments here and there. But, and again, Captain Stredbeck told me his only option was to fly around until he ran out of fuel. So we get this, in this report, it said that our bomber crashed in Meadows of Dan, Virginia. Here are some pictures of the crash on October 1st, 1944. It crashed at 4:50 a.m. in Farmer Charlie Bud Gold's pig lot. And bless her heart, Ruth Jean Bolt, one of the women I interviewed, at the very end of her interview, she said, "And you know, there was debris everywhere, but not one pig. And there were pigs running all over the place, and not one pig was injured or killed." And several people I interviewed told me about all the baby pigs running up and over all the debris of the crash. Now, here's where the story gets really crazy. Meadows of Dan, as you can imagine, is not a very big place. So I'm living in North Carolina, about in the middle of North Carolina, and a year ago, January, I said to my husband, Roger, I said, "So I wonder where Meadows of Dan is." Well, we looked on a map, and it was right north of Mount Airy, North Carolina, home of Andy Griffith, and less than 3 hours from my home. Well, I've been a writer for 20, 30 years, and that was like a big sign that I needed to do something about this story. So I went to call Meadows of Dan. Well, you don't call Meadows of Dan, it's a crossroads. And so I called the Patrick County Historical Society, and the gentleman in the center on this slide is a wonderful man named John Reynolds. He's the secretary of the Patrick County Historical Society. And I introduced myself, and I said, I'd like information about the bomber that crashed on October 1st, 1944 in Meadows of Dan. And he says, oh, no. It wasn't October, it was March, and it wasn't a B-17, it was a B-24, and 11 crew members were killed. And I said, no, I'm talking about the one that crashed on October 1st, and all the crew survived. And he, a big pause, and he says, I'm 64 years old. I've lived here my whole life. I know nothing of this story. I said, well, I can tell you the farmer's field it landed in. I can tell you all the neighbors and people that came to the aid of the crew. And so therein opened up this tremendous, interesting little mystery that they're delighted about. And they feel like I put Meadows of Dan on the map. So now I unearthed this crash, had no idea it would be this big thing that nobody forgot. One lady I interviewed, who's in her late 80s, she said, you know, I never even told my kids about it. And it was a big deal when we were little kids. I mean, there was stuff everywhere. And man, it made so much noise. I never told my kids about it. No one can figure out why no one talked about it. But nevertheless, it was not talked about because I was supposed to discover it. I mean, what else could it be, right? Last May, a year ago, May 3rd, 2015, I met these two gentlemen in Meadows of Dan, and they showed Roger and myself, showed us where the bomber crashed. Now, I have to tell you something that doesn't really mean anything, or I don't know what it means, is I've written a children's book called Harley the Alligator. Now, I never in my life ever met an Harley, but over the last 20 years, people would say, oh, my uncle, or oh, I knew somebody. And I'm involved in this bomber story, and the two people that are going to show me the most important thing about the bomber, both are named Harley. And I don't know what that means, but so Harley Dalton was a young boy. He lived with the Goads. The Goads were his grandparents. He wasn't there that particular night, so he showed me exactly where in the pig lot the bomber came down. And Harley Burnett was 11 years old and lived about a mile from the site and heard the bomber circle and crash. And of course, the young kids came running over. Well, everyone did to help. So now we know where it crashed. I asked Harley, how different does this site look today than it did back in 1944? And he said, well, it looked pretty much the same. You see the swamp cabbages, the scrubby little trees. But he said the trees around the edges, of course, are bigger. It's been 70 years. But he said it really doesn't look a whole lot different than when my grandparents had the farm here. One of the first women to call, you see, they had no information about this bomber, so what was I to do? I called the radio station in Southern Virginia and went on the radio station and did a talk, told them what I was looking for, and people started coming out of the woodwork. And then they would say, oh, you have to talk to so-and-so, and you have to talk to so-and-so. So that's how I started to get calls from people who told me these stories. Now, Vera Barnard Sigler was about 12 years old when the bomber crashed. They live over the mountain about a mile away, but her father rescued Captain Stredbeck when he parachuted out. Now, I understand they had no idea where they were when he ordered them to bail. He could not see the ground. Michael Hoban, one of the pilots said he never saw the ground until he hit it. He was the most severely injured, snapped his tibia, fibia, and many broken bones in his ankle. So it was a pretty cloudy, but this house behind her was the actual house. It had a fire, and they hadn't taken it down. She insisted that we come and see where the porch was, where her father was calling out because of the crash. He went out in the morning. It was 4:50 in the morning, and so it was still very, very dark. And he called, and Captain Stredbeck came from over the hill there, right over the hill. And she said those trees weren't there. It was a cornfield, but he came walking over the hill. And, you know, one of the stories I had to dispel, one of the wonderful stories, well, part of it's true, is that when Captain Stredbeck walked into the Barnard's house, he was carrying his parachute, and he handed it to her 16-year-old sister and said, "Here, make a wedding dress out of this parachute." And I can't tell you how many people I interviewed said, "And you know, there was a girl who made her wedding dress out of that parachute." Well, I asked Vera, and she had to tell me that no, her sister never did, because her brother was a pilot, and he was in the military, and he came home on leave and saw that parachute, and he said, "You got to send that back. You can't keep that parachute." So it never got made into a wedding dress, but there's still the belief that it had. Now, the other caveat for me and for all of you, if should you go for a ride on the Blue Ridge Parkway, is shortly after the war, the Goads sold their farm to the National Park System for the Blue Ridge Parkway. And so this is the way it looked in 1937. I can imagine that it didn't look much different in 44. The Blue Ridge Parkway was in the process of being built, and when the war, and it had gone as far as Mabry's Mill, and construction stopped when the money was diverted for the war effort. So I'm guessing it looked pretty much like that. And this is what it looks like today. It is considered to be the most photographed spot on the Blue Ridge Parkway. I guess I don't have the slide on here. What's really amazing is, you know, one of my writer friends who writes for the Blue Ridge said, you gotta talk to the Blue Ridge historians. So I called them and explained what I wanted, and of course they said, "What crash?" And here it is on their property. So they weren't going to take the word of some crazy lady who calls them on the phone and tells them about this fantastical story. And so last year, their archaeologists went to the site with the deed and the maps and everything and verified that it is indeed on the Blue Ridge Parkway's property. It's right behind the restaurant. If you ever go there, there's a restaurant, and there is, behind the restaurant is overflow parking, and next to overflow parking to the right, 2 storage sheds and then a woods, and that's where the bomber came down, in those woods. There was a 6-man crew. They all survived, but they were all injured. 4 of them landed in Willis, Virginia, which was about 15 miles away from the crash site. They bailed together. They bailed first, and then the captain and Hardy Fitzko were the last ones out, and they landed within a half a mile or so of the crash site, and were taken there. They landed separate from each other, and they each made it to the crash site by themselves. But this is First Lieutenant Michael Hoban. He stayed in the military. As far as I know, the entire crew stayed in and all retired. He retired as a major. This is a picture of him. The picture of, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Okay, this is when he was younger, and of course that's not a B-17, and I know that. But this was a picture of him on his 99th birthday. He does not look 99 to me at all. Anyways, he's the one, he told me, I never saw the ground until I hit it. And he doesn't remember a whole lot because he was in shock, and it was quite an ordeal to, he was screaming, and the other 3 pilots came together, found him, and then one, now understand they were all injured in some way, but one had to walk for over an hour and a half to try to find somebody that could help. And if you go there, I mean, these are the real hills and mountains of Virginia, and the houses are here and there and everywhere, and there was fog to the ground. So he couldn't see where he was going. He finally saw a car went by on a road, so he knew there was a road through that thicket. So then he went up there. So it took a long time to get help, to get back to where he was. And interestingly enough, in Patrick County at the time, there was only one ambulance, and it was in use somewhere else. So the hearse from the Mayberry Funeral Home came, and one gentleman said, well, they were lucky because a hearse is much more comfortable than that ambulance. So the gentleman came and got all 4 of them and put them in the hearse, and they were going to drive, the hearse was to drive them to Road Oak, to the military hospital there. Now understand, gas was rationed, so this was a big decision. How are we going to get these men to that hospital? So here's the captain, Arvil Stredbeck. Both he and Michael Hoban turned 100 in April. They are both as with it as you and I are, assuming we're still here with it, but anyways, you can see him as a young soldier with his wife and son. And if you can imagine, of all the amazing record that he has in the military, that he should get a call about a stateside crash and have a book written about it. You know, it's not very glamorous, but he's been very gracious about it, and I've enjoyed talking to him. So my goal now is to get a historical marker on the spot, and let me just show you here. Here is where the mill is, if you're on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And here's the restaurant, and here's the crash site. The bomber should have been turned more because it kind of circled this way and came this way into the field, more on an angle. This is like walking across the parking lot from here to here. This is the overflow parking. And right next to this parking lot are these storage sheds, and right next to the storage sheds are these 2 rocks. And I'm hoping that we can have a historical marker placed between those 2 rocks. I was informed a week ago that it looks like we might be moving forward on a historical marker, so I'm really, really excited about that. But it will not be my decision where it goes, but I can't think of a better spot than right there. One of the stories that that several people told me was that the young boys went in and took pieces parts and made rings out of them. And every time I talked to someone, I asked them, do you have a ring? Do you have a ring? And, oh, no, well, I had one once. I don't know where it is. Well, on October 1st, 2015, on the 71st anniversary of the crash, I did my book launch there with the people of Medals of Dan. And after I talked about the ring and all the other stuff involved, this gentleman came up to me and he said, just a minute. He said, this belongs to you. And he gave me this ring that Coy Hall, young Coy Hall, made from something from the instrument panel. Now, my husband and most men who look at this think it was a nut, that maybe it was just easily milled around. But I was surprised at how finely tuned it was. And I expected something that would look really, really crude. And I was reminded that the people in West Virginia were and still are very skilled craftsmen. And at that time, even though they had no electricity, most of the homes were still being lit with kerosene in 44. There were only 2 or 3 telephones in the county, and most everyone had outdoor plumbing. These people made everything. They made their utensils, their doorknobs, their silverware. They made what they needed. So the young boys would have been trained at a very young age and would have had the skill to make a ring this well. One thing that an author lives for, if you're writing nonfiction, are primary sources, going right to the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I was very fortunate in having primary sources for this. Arthur Blackboard and Dave Dutcher helped me a great deal. Of course, John Reynolds and Vera was the young girl whose father rescued the pilot. And Joe Rogers is my classmate who started all this. And then we have the two Harleys who lived it, and Michael Hoban. I was very pleased and proud to have been able to visit with him in his residential home where he lives in Bradenton, Florida, last January. And that was a thrill. He has a bedroom full of World War II pictures of all things that he was involved in, and it's just a wonderful experience. So I was able to say to the class, those that are still alive, the class actually from 1943 to 47, because remember, there were 7th through 12th graders. I was able to say to them, you have nothing to be disheartened about anymore. You did an extraordinary thing by buying this B-17 bomber. And today, $375,000 is equivalent to $5,248,335.79, and that was as of last week. I updated it, so that's very close to what the value is now. So that's the story of the Buy a Bomber program. In the back of the book, I was able to put an appendix of the 220 entities, cities, organizations, schools. There were only a couple other schools. There were several whole school systems, but there were only a couple other schools. And I will tell you something interesting I found out after the fact is we don't know how many of these 220 actually got to have a dedication ceremony. We know that the general in charge of the Air Force at the time made our dedication ceremony happen. But as the war continued and they were trying to get pilots into the air as fast as possible, they did not have time for this. So what they would do is an artist would draw up a rendition of the name, and they would superimpose it over the side of a bomber and take a photograph and send that photograph to some of the people that had raised the money. And so the gentleman who maintains the list told me that many of the organizations have tried to trace their bomber. No one's been able to. So I don't know why we were able to, but it just all kind of happened. And I'm thrilled. This has been so much fun for me. I can't imagine any more fun writing anything else. It's opened up my eyes to so many lives and wonderful stories from World War II veterans to families that remember stories. I could go on and on and on. There's lots more in the book. The detail of what was going on in the cockpit is detailed in the book. I quoted Captain Stredback and some of the other pilots, and I've had it. You know, I know nothing about flying a plane, so that chapter really freaked me out. But I had 3 amazing top pilots, including Captain Stredback, went over it and assured me that what I said in there actually could happen and did happen. But at any rate, so that's the story of We Bought a Bomber, the Buy a Bomber program. And please, somebody, I've given most of you postcards. You can contact me through my website. If somebody gets a picture or finds a picture of the bomber that was purchased by the city of Ypsilanti, please let me know the details. I'm fascinated with this, and we're trying to. We've already located 2 additional bombers that weren't on his list. So the book is opening up a lot of different stories and a lot of different eyes. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Now that was a big cheat because that gentleman went to South High School and graduated in 1965, and he's very, very happy to say that I am older than he is.
What about the cleaning up the site? Is there anything left that the people gathered?
Well, interesting that you should ask that.
What did he ask?
I'm sorry. He asked if anything about the cleanup of the site and what might still be there. In the book, you will see a photograph of something that we found a part of the bomber when we walked the property on May 3rd, 2015. John Reynolds, the secretary, was with my husband and I, and we were walking through, and he saw something shiny on the ground. He picked it up, and on it said USAAF, and there were a bunch of numbers. So now, of course, we have this wonderful thing called a smartphone. My husband plugged the numbers in the smartphone, and up came, it's exactly what it said, World War II, U.S. Army Air Force Aviation plug socket. And we all just gasped. Now, Arlie Dalton told us, there was another mythical story. One lady said, every time we take my father there to the restaurant, he points out that window and says, right over there, that bomber crashed and there's still 2 engines buried in the swamp. And several people told me the engines were buried in the swamp. Well, Arlie Dalton, whose grandpa owned the property, said, no. The military came in, they dug out the engines that were in the swamp, they took all the big stuff, and his grandpa had to sign a paper that it was okay to leave the little stuff. And so there's a lot of little stuff there. And of course, now that it has been dubbed an archaeological site, and so now it's illegal to go in and get anything out of there, but they're pretty sure that there's a lot more there. Normally, they will not put a historical marker on a site that has not been completely cleared of artifacts. But the superintendent, in a letter, mentioned that they often make an exception with bombers because there's so many pieces, parts, there's no way they're going to clear a site. So yes, there's stuff there. And we also have a gentleman who grew up there, who was there, who said he was 7, and he walked up and there was a fuel filter laying on the ground, and he tucked it under his shirt and took it home and used it as a paperweight for 70 years. He has since donated it to the Patrick County Historical Society. And this ring, by the way, will go to the Patrick County Historical Society at some point. It's been on my finger since October 1st, 2015. I'm not ready to give it up yet, but I will, because it's important to me that they have something there for a display of our bomber that came down there. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
Was the ship still referred to as the Spirit of South High when it went down?
We don't believe it was, because if you think about it, military vehicles of all kinds within the United States, you're not allowed to put graffiti on it. But it's only over at war where they were able to decorate and do those things. So we believe that it probably, the Spirit of South High was taken off the side of it by the time, right after it got back to base. We're pretty sure that that's what happened. I asked Captain Stredbeck, did you ever see the Spirit of South High written on it? And he said no. He said he heard that kids had bought it, but he had never seen anything on the side of it. So, are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Where was it manufactured?
I believe that most of the B-17s were made out in California. I don't know exactly where this one was made. There were other B-17 plants, I believe, right? Come on, all you World War II people. Pardon me?
There were several in California.
Yeah.
Oh, were the kids of South High disheartened when they found out that the plane they bought was used for training and that crashed stateside and not in the war in Europe or something like that? That newspaper article that showed the gentleman that had 1990 on it, they were devastated.
They were devastated. I mean, they put their heart and soul in that campaign. And, you know, and when you think about it, it very well could have had a major influence on the war, just with the one pilot that was on the bomber when it crashed, and what he did. So, yes, they were very disheartened. That's what the whole article was about, how disheartened they were. And so, well, you've been very attentive. You've been sitting a long time, so thank you very much. And do you need to say anything, Megan? Do you need to say anything?